Hey, I'm Lurpus. I played Counter-Strike for a living for 8 years. I've been on the desk for some of the biggest events for 5 years. I know nothing about Counter-Strike, but then again, neither does Thorin. Welcome to his YouTube channel.
On this day, October 2017, 5 years ago in 2017, Ninjas in Pyjamas, NiP, were finally dethroned for good at the time from the #1 spot in CSGO. This was the moment when we finally realised they'd been toppled. Yeah, they'd lost before, but this marked the time where VeryGames would take that torch from them, be a clear world #1 for the next solid 4+ months. NiP didn't win another international title until the 20th of April 2014, which is about 6 months later. But up until that point, NiP had been impossibly good. They'd won their first 10 lands before they'd finally lost one. Sure, not all elite tournaments, but numerous of them international tournaments. Get Right and Forest were basically unchallenged as the elite players for the first 6-7 months. Then along came Dossier and Virtus.pro, the CIS Virtus.pro. Then along came Guardian, who joined Virtus.pro. Then along came Shocks to VeryGames. And finally, we had people who really were at their level as superstar players who could go head-to-head with them and actually beat them in games. Freiburg, playing as an entry player, playing as a good CT player, was still a god in the game within his role. Sure, he wasn't Get Right and Forest, but at his role, he was so overpowered. He gave NiP all these crazy advantages. Even when NiP had lost in the past, their losses had been basically brief moments in which they hadn't been able to win, and no true rival had risen up as a result of one of those losses and established any kind of dominance over NiP or won many events beyond that. So, for example, the first tournament NiP lost was Star Series Season 5, where Virtus.pro played them in an epic match in the upper bracket final. Epic match in the final. Sure, won all the maps, but really close games. Everyone's like, wow, I can't wait for this Virtus.pro lineup, which was like a Dren and Angel and these guys. I can't wait for these guys to play against NiP again. Problem is, the Virtus.pro lineup didn't even survive with that exact 5-man lineup. NiP, on the other hand, went over, won other lands. They won ESEA LAN, they won DreamHack Summer. Virtus.pro came back, but this time with Guardian in the lineup instead of a Dren. They were, after losing at DreamHack Summer in the semi-finals, they were able to actually get another win over NiP. They beat them in the semi-finals of EMS One Summer, but then went on to the final and lost to VeryGames, who had just gotten Shocks in the lineup. And so there we go. VeryGames wins their first international LAN at a tournament that also had NiP in attendance. But the caveat, the asterisk is, you didn't play NiP. You didn't beat NiP. You still haven't beaten NiP. That was the key part. Western Wolves came along. We're talking about in sort of March, April point of time. They managed to get second place, Esports Heaven Vienna, maybe that was February. Then there was Copenhagen Games, second place again. They're beating out VeryGames, beating out Na'Vi. But they didn't win the tournament. They didn't really challenge NiP. They came second. They beat the other teams. VeryGames themselves had been up and down over the year. They'd had those 4 second places in a row to start CSGO, losing to NiP every time. Then they took in Scream when RPK retired. They got more up and down. Sure, they won some tournaments where NiP didn't attend. They beat some of the other top teams. But then they also had international tournaments where NiP was. And oftentimes they weren't even meeting NiP in the final anymore. They would lose now to, they lost to the likes of Western Wolves. Then you got to a situation where Shocks comes and joins VeryGames. Kenny S gets kicked out after they've had too many losses. In comes Shocks. The team manages to win EMS One Summer, as I say. But they did it because Virtus.pro took care of NiP for them. Then NiP comes right back. They go to DreamHack Bucharest. They beat VeryGames in the quarterfinals. They go on and win the title. Everyone's like, right, NiP's back in the driving seat. That was yet another temporary loss, plus it's to the same call, the Virtus.pro guys. VeryGames still haven't beaten them. No big deal, right? At Star Series Season 7, here's the first time when VeryGames beats NiP on LAN. And it looked amazing. It was in the upper bracket final, I think. Then in the lower bracket, everyone's waiting for NiP to go back to the final, to double elim tournament, play VeryGames in the final, and then let's see what happens in the rematch, right? They don't get to, because at this point, the Virtus.pro team has already split up, made the Astana Dragon super team from CIS, and they're the ones who beat NiP. This is during their streak of beating NiP in big matches. So you kind of felt cheated out of the match. You got kind of cock-teased, like, oh, we didn't get the proper final we were supposed to do. NiP's second life got took by Astana. Then along comes EMS One Fall. Now we'll see if VeryGames can repeat it. Well, They both get to the semi-finals. They're both on opposite sides of the bracket from winning their groups. NiP's playing Copenhagen Wolves. This was the core, at least in terms of Dupree and Zipnix and Fetish, who later on became Dignitas. And then once Fetish left and Carrigan came in and Device was in the squad, they became TSM. And later now, obviously, Astralis. Device wasn't in this team at the time, actually. Instead, he was out of the squad, and Freese and Pimp were in the team instead. They actually won the first map against NiP. Dust 2, they did this crazy comeback. Then NiP wins the other 2 maps, as you'd expect. They go to the final. VeryGames takes care of Universal Soldiers, which was the team with Neo and Taz. And in the final, we get the rematch we'd been waiting for. The final we wanted from Star Series Season 7, because that was another factor. But did VeryGames beat them because it was a double elim tournament? Would they have beaten them in the grand final there when all the pressure was on them because NiP were the ultimate winners under pressure, right? VeryGames, prior to their win at Star Series, with different lineups, had lost 8 best of 3 series to the NiP lineup on LAN. They'd only won 1, which was at Star Series. NiP, obviously, with their storyline of coming back and winning championships after they lose occasionally, they were very motivated to get revenge, as they had always done against everyone else. NiP wins the first map, Nuke, one of their home maps, big time. VeryGames, very good Nuke team. You might think, right, they're in trouble now. Second map, VeryGames goes up big on cash. NiP runs it all the way back. They get to 14 rounds. This is where NiP would always have come through. They would always have beaten VeryGames. Now they would win. They would win 2-0. They'd say that fucking tournament didn't matter at Star Series. Whatever. We have bad results in Kiev anyway. Now we're back at the big time, baby. Now we're here to do it. Famously, there was the ESEA LAN where there'd been 2 16-14 wins for NiP in a series there because they'd never lost a map to VeryGames on LAN. That had actually gotten Kenny S booted out of the team. That's why Shocks was brought in. The Decider comes along because VeryGames hold on and win. The Decider is Infernal, one of NiP's very best maps. They had never lost it on LAN to any variant of VeryGames. Doesn't matter. VeryGames comes through. VeryGames wins big time. VeryGames wins the title. That's 2 best of 3s in a row. That's 2 big titles in a row. NiP's at both the tournaments. That's 3 international titles LANs that NiP was in attendance of 4 that they'd attended. And NiP obviously won Dream at Bucharest. In the match, Scream has a really good series. He'd been doing very well against NiP in tournaments, including Star Series. He was hitting his best streak of form, which was part of the reason VeryGames was peaking. NBK was incredibly strong over the whole LAN and top fragged this final. Shocks was becoming the best player in CSGO, even though this final wasn't necessarily his best work. And obviously later on in time, especially when we went into the LDLC era, actually became the player who, unlike the other French players, had sort of an advantage when he played NiP. He nearly always won the majority of his finals, the majority of his big games against them. This title added to the Star Ladder title, now unseated NiP at the top spot. Now it put VeryGames there. VeryGames at the next tournament, ESWC on home soil in France, would win a 3rd straight best of 3 series against NiP. They would win in the semi-finals. Admittedly, they went into the final and lost to Clan Mystic, but to be fair, Clan Mystic obviously had Kaylee, who no one will ever know how legit this player was on LAN. The teams did meet in the semi-final of the first major, DreamHack Winter 2013, a few weeks later. In the semi-finals there, NiP got their revenge, but ultimately it didn't matter because NiP didn't win the final themselves. They lost to Fnatic. So this was the real key day. This is when VeryGames proved that they were legit. They were going to be the number 1 team. They weren't able to get as many wins as NiP. Beyond that, they still won a number of titles and became the 2nd best team in CSGO history quite clearly and true champions in their own rights. But this was the day when NiP really fell off from being that unbeatable dominant force. This video was kindly supported by Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Landon Thompson, NateDOhDoubleG, Kyla Harris, Travis Greb, James Harding, Daniel Yordanov, VeXii, Robert Baxter, and a special thanks goes out as always to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Would you like to ask me a question in my monthly AMA? Would you fancy a few teasers for what's coming up in my content? How about taking part in an esports discussion with me? Well, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.